Now it's my pleasure to speak a little bit about data. I know that data can sound a bit sobering, but actually you'll see that it will actually illustrate some of the findings and some of the experience that have been shared in this room. So I've put up a number of slides. Like Dana, I have to say that the bad news is that there are many. The good news is that I will go quickly through them and that you will have a chance to look at the presentation online. And also, of course, we are basing that on a publication. So today versus tomorrow, what international evidence says, and well, at the OECD, we do a lot of data, a lot of evidence. We do not think it's only to infirm or confirm what we already know. The interest of developing evidence and data is to take the deep dive, is to understand really what are the weaknesses for people, but also to understand how we can improve their situation. And at the same time, doing international comparisons allow us to identify effective approaches in some countries. I have to say that what I'm presenting today is the result of a survey conducted in 30 countries. It's pretty much a collective exercise, so I feel I really need to thank the members of the INFE that have made possible the development of the survey. I'd like to thank also the countries that have participated in the survey, and I'd like to thank my colleague, Adele Atkinson, if you can stand up. Adele has been actually developing the questionnaire for many years. Yes, please, big applause for her. And I've been working tirelessly for the last weeks and months to develop that survey. So here's what I have for you. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the questionnaire itself, just that you understand what we are actually looking at in terms of financial literacy across the different countries. Second, of course, I want to get you through some of the results. I've selected only some of them. The data is very rich, the publication is very rich, so if you're interested, I recommend that you have a look at the publication itself. And of course, we want to share with you some selected findings. I very much agree with what Diana said at the beginning. We are not only there to think, we are here to do. And if we are developing data, it's not only to contemplate the data, it's to do something about it. And then some next steps, because for us, of course, developing data is not the end. We want to enlarge the data collection that we have, and we also want to identify more effective practices. So quite quickly, the questionnaire by itself, as mentioned, it was a long process to develop it. Actually, the story started when the INFE was created back in 2008. One of the main goals was to measure financial literacy across countries. And we were even wondering whether that would be possible. Well, here we are, 6 years later, with a survey. So we originally had the first version of the questionnaire that was piloted in 14 countries in 2010. And then we made a revision to that. So in terms of what we're measuring, it's very important to understand that by financial literacy, within the OECD and the INFE, we don't only mean knowledge, we really mean skills, attitudes, and behavior necessary to make sound financial decisions and ultimately achieve individual financial well-being. So a definition that is similar to what you would call here financial capability, just a question of terminology, really. So the survey is actually available online. It's presented as a toolkit with core question, optional question that some countries may wish to implement, as well as some guide in order to implement the survey. The original questionnaire was actually welcomed by G20 leaders in 2013, and as I mentioned, we decided to revise the questionnaire in 2015. First, we had a look at the pilot exercise that we conducted to see whether we needed to change some of the question. And second, we wanted to look at new areas of financial literacy that some countries felt were particularly interesting. So this is the toolkit, and I have to say that this questionnaire and this survey is pretty much a complement to work we are doing on core competency on financial literacy, which are actually defining the objective of financial literacy strategy. Well, it's nice she can come along, we can sing together. Enjoyable, first time. I'll try to continue while you're listening to the music. So the core questionnaire is actually 3 areas, as I just mentioned. We are looking at financial behavior with a series of 9 questions. Then financial knowledge is also for us a component of financial literacy. As mentioned by Jane, we don't think that financial knowledge do it all, but we do believe that understanding key financial concept is important. And then we also include some question about financial attitude to understand a little bit more how consumers are behaving, and also in terms of designing financial literacy program, it's kind of important to understand the time preference, for example, of consumers and individuals. This will really help shape a financial education program that have more chance to be successful. But of course, we are not only interested in financial literacy. We want to look at its relationship with other components. So we are also assessing financial inclusion. We also have data on socio-demographic. We want to look at financial literacy by different age, gender, education, work and income. And as I mentioned, we are now exploring also new areas, financial well-being, fraud, and an interesting question on self-assessment of financial knowledge. And now I know that you're more interested in the result than the questionnaire itself, but I believe it was important for you to understand what we are trying to survey. And so I'm very happy because the publication is just off the press, so it's very fresh. It's available for you outside, and it's very exciting for us. As I said, it's the end of a long process, but certainly just a step. So in very brief, 30 countries, including New Zealand, have participated in this exercise. Overall, more than 50,000 adults aged between 18 and 79 were interviewed. We have the questionnaire now translated into 30 languages. And in terms of analysis, of course, we are looking at individual questions, but we are also looking at minimum target scores achieved in financial knowledge, behavior and attitude, and we are also combining the 3 components into a first financial literacy score, and I will present to you the result now. So just a list of countries. You can see that there's a kind of nice geographical spread with Asia Pacific, Europe, Africa, North and South America represented in the countries that have participated. I will now look at each of the components, financial knowledge, financial behavior, and attitude, and just give you a brief snapshot of the results. We are looking now at the average on financial knowledge, and you see that on average across the participating countries, only 56% of adults achieve what we call the minimum target score in terms of financial knowledge. You see that the OECD average is slightly higher than the overall average, but not by far, and that New Zealand is slightly above the OECD average, so probably a good news. At the same time, if you look at the glass half empty, it also means that typically in New Zealand, 47% of the population, almost 40% of the population doesn't reach this minimum target score. Of course, we may be more interested in behavior, but we also see some correlation between the two. Now, looking at areas of financial knowledge that we consider countries should probably prioritize, certainly the first one is the understanding of interest, and especially compound interest. Here I've put up the question that are included in our questionnaire, because sometimes I get questioned about the fact that compound interest is quite complicated, but actually our question is quite simple, and our question doesn't really involve a lot of numeracy skills. It's just an understanding of the concept with interest rate. You're paid on your interest if you save, and you're paying interest on your interest if you have a credit product. So just this basic understanding is very, very weak. Actually, 42% of adults on average kind of grasp this concept well, which is very, very low. If you consider that it's really key in terms of your product choice, credit and saving in particular. Another area that is relatively weak is the understanding of risk diversification, which, again, if we think about decision in terms of investment, can be worrying. And it's especially true in some countries, actually. It's also interesting to look country by country and to look at, let's say, high achiever and lower achiever. You see that in some countries, there are a large proportion of the population that have answered most of the financial knowledge correctly. In a country like New Zealand, we see that there are a group of very good achievers, but also a substantial proportion of the population that has difficulty with financial knowledge. And then I have to say it, I'm a woman, but still I have to report back on the result. we still find some important gap in terms of financial knowledge between men and women. On average, there is almost 10 points difference in OECD countries, and you see that in New Zealand, only looking at financial knowledge, there is almost 20-point difference between men and women, which is quite considerable. Looking at behavior now, if we look at behavior, so we had 9 questions, and we are looking at different areas: budget, active saving, long-term planning, choice of products, and we see that across our countries, only 51% of respondents achieve the minimum target score. It's not bad, but it means that the other half of the population really doesn't reach the kind of core competency that we would like them to have in order to make financial decisions. So quite worrying. Here again, you see that New Zealand is higher than the average of OECD. Now, if we want to look at some of the behavior that is more concerning, certainly budget is one of the areas that is complicated for adults. On average, we see that only 60% of adults report having a household budget. If we look at financial literacy definition, having a budget and being able to actually balance your needs and your wants and your saving and your expenses is really key competency for financial literacy. So seeing that 40% of adults do not do that is kind of concerning in terms of how they control their budget. The other area is, of course, long-term planning and setting long-term goals. Here we see that only 50% of the respondents are actually doing that. And another area that is important and where the policy conclusion and lessons can be quite important is shopping around and looking for information and advice. Here again, most of the population are actually not shopping around and are not necessarily referring to independent advice, but are most of the time relying on their family and friends for information and advice on financial issues. And when we know that the level of financial literacy is not that high, it's not necessarily the best way to go. So the different components, I'll be quick on that. So you'll see this chart just on household budget. Again, New Zealand is between the OECD average here and the average of all countries. Looking at another very important area of financial behavior is whether people are able to make ends meet. So that's the first question, but we know that the ability to make ends meet may be related to external factors, such as loss of income or something like that. But we are also interested in understanding whether what they do if they are unable to make ends meet. And in our survey, we find that 1 in 5 individuals are actually borrowing to make ends meet, meaning typically that they don't have the buffer to face external shock and that their financial resilience is relatively low. Again, here you see a wide variation between countries. In some countries, most of the respondents are not borrowing to make ends meet, but if you look at, for example, at countries like Thailand, Georgia, Turkey, there is a large proportion of the population that are actually borrowing to make ends meet. Something I mentioned, indeed, there's very little shopping around and even, I would say, almost no recourse to independent advice in most of the countries. And when we know, again, the low level of financial literacy, this is really certainly something that policymakers may want to consider in the future, at least for part of the population. And this is the combination of financial knowledge, financial attitude, and financial behavior. So providing with a first score on financial literacy, overall, we see that the results show low level of financial literacy with, on average, 13.2 out of a total mark of 21. Once again, the questionnaire is really aimed at assessing basic level of financial literacy. The questions are by no means very difficult, so it means that there is really room for improvement. Now, selected policy lessons, I could be very long, but I think it's better that we engage in a discussion. For us, the main finding is that still we perceive the level of financial literacy to be low, and we think it reinforces the message that financial education should really start early. We want to reinforce the financial knowledge. I didn't go into the detail, but you see that countries that are doing quite well on financial knowledge are also more educated countries quite often. So really important to try to reinforce that. But we know that knowledge is not enough. And again, we we believe that schools have the ability to develop sound habits in young people, especially in terms of budgeting and in terms of long-term planning, which are partly weak in most part of the population. And then when we're thinking about the gender gaps, probably school can also play a role in that. Now, of course, we don't want to leave the adults aside, and there are a number of areas that I mentioned that are quite weak in terms of behavior, and we want to support the adults to be more financially resilient and improve certainly active choices of products. So here again, I think what Jane described earlier is really, really relevant. The idea is to have a mix of financial education, but also try to simplify the information for consumers. So in terms of budget, certainly the new tools and apps that are providing an easy way to do budget is something to consider. But for groups that are particularly in difficulty, certainly you want to go beyond that, and face-to-face advice could be useful. One of the areas that is especially weak is the planning ahead. Again, that is one of the findings that is interesting, is that we see a strong correlation between financial knowledge and people that are able to plan ahead. So we believe, again, that there is a case for combining a focus on financial knowledge as well as some nudges in order to push people into making actions towards the future. Last but not least, access to information on products should certainly be improved. It's not only an education issue, it's also a regulation issue. Providing also information to consumers that will allow them to compare products more easily is important. And certainly there is something to think about around advice. The problem is that the consumers that most need advice are not seeking financial advice, quite often because financial advice is expensive. So certainly there is a case for trying to find ways to make financial advice cheaper, at least for part of the population that wants it, and to make also this advice more visible and more accessible to consumers that may need it. Lastly, of course, as I mentioned, financial education is only part of the story. If we look at countries that are doing quite well, especially on the behavioral side, we see that quite often there is a strong consumer protection framework, especially in the area of credit. So something that we want to really emphasize. Of course, the pension system will have an impact on how much people are actually saving for the long term, as well as taxation sometimes. We also want to highlight that the economic and financial situation certainly have an impact on how literate people are, and especially how they're behaving. The current low level of interest rate and inflation certainly have an impact on the short-termism of consumers and may have a longer-term impact on their habits. So certainly something to monitor for the future. Next step, very quickly. So we will continue working on especially gender differences. I just showed that there is a gap in financial knowledge. The situation on behavior is much more complex, and there is wide variation across countries. So we want to grasp a little bit better what is happening between the competencies of men and women in this particular area. We'll work on inclusion and financial literacy, as well as different target audiences, and explore a new concept within the INFE, not necessarily a new concept, but we will explore definition and how to frame it internationally. It is financial well-being. And last but not least, we are also programming to, based on this data and additional data that we will be collecting in the next month, we'll have a G20 report on financial literacy for the German presidency. And this is all I have for you for now, but now I have a question. I know, Chiara.
There was a lot of information there. Personally and professionally, what surprised you most?
Maybe the variation between country and at the same time the consistency of the result. It's very interesting when you develop a questionnaire and you see that across country the areas of weaknesses are similar. As a woman, I have to say that I was also not necessarily surprised, but it's hard to understand why women, for example, will have lower level of financial knowledge, and we know that most women are actually the one taking care of their house budget and things like that, caring for the kids. And when we look at the results, it's a bit disturbing to see that. And how to explain it is not necessarily easy either. We know that there is a combination of culture and other things, but that's probably something that has been even troubling us in the OECD team for a long time. Like, how can we explain this and how can we improve the situation?
That's been an historic approach, hasn't it, too? The gender gap in financial knowledge is not new.
No, it's not new. What we see with the result that there are also issues around financial resilience of women on the long term. So we see that they are quite okay managing day-to-day budget and things like that, but it's much more difficult for them to plan for the long term and maybe I would say for themselves.
From the results, what else worries you most?
I mentioned on the knowledge side, certainly the very low understanding of compound interest, which certainly have a strong impact on how people choose product or do not choose product. And certainly the long-term planning and the very poor choice of products are something to be considered, especially when we know, I mean, it's been mentioned this morning, finance is going digital. It means that decisions are quicker. And if people are already not shopping around with traditional financial products, then it's even more worrying, you know, for credit pushing online and things like that.
If knowledge is key, what else needs to be done to translate that knowledge into action?
So as I mentioned a little bit, there is a case for simplifying things for consumers, like information clearer, certainly, and then a combination of education and nudges. Certainly, again, digital tools may create new risk, but they are also very powerful in terms of reminding people, for example, of saving or simply self-nudging themselves into saving more if their income is increasing. So there is a great potentiality for doing that. So we believe that it's a combination of doing this very early to build, as Jane mentioned, to build the habits young, and then to remind people constantly. It's a lifelong process.
How does it help you to compare countries in this way? What do you learn? What actions do you then take?
What is interesting with different countries is we are looking at if a country is doing partly good, we are looking at what kind of policy they have in place. If I may, something else that surprised me is how good my own country, France, was doing on financial behavior. And I analyzed the question by question, and one of the answers is that probably they do regulate a lot the credit market, which makes things extremely easy then for consumers. So that's less of an education issue in that case than a consumer protection one. But we will also look at Hong Kong, for example. Hong Kong has a very, very high level of financial knowledge, and on the behavior they are doing very well. So we would also look at what these kind of countries are doing and look if it's culturally applicable to other countries.
You had a cross-section of countries there, but some weren't there. I noticed Australia, for instance, wasn't in the mix. What do you learn regionally that you can transform, that you can translate into local economies?
Well, it will be always for country to pick up what they think is applying to their culture. Certainly, if we look at the result from New Zealand, I don't want to compare New Zealand and Australia, certainly not today. And actually, but actually, we have another assessment for young people. It's PISA financial literacy, and we had both countries with similar results, I have to say. So certainly, what we see for New Zealand wouldn't be completely wrong for Australia, in a sense.
You mentioned Hong Kong as being an example of a country that was scoring quite well on the data. There were others like Norway. There was no commonality in terms of culture or ethnicities. So you're saying that there are individual programs that must be working in those countries, and you're going to cherry pick the best of them. Yes,
exactly. But the thing is that there are many things that are influencing financial decision, financial behavior. So there are certainly financial education policies that may be good, but as I mentioned, there is regulation, there is in part culture. So that's why it's probably easier, as you mentioned, to compare countries within a region rather than looking at countries that are very, very different from each other, because you would need to consider the regulatory framework, you would need to consider the economic situation as well.
Just coming back to the gender gap as well, because female literacy is still lagging behind. Is that reflecting patriarchal societies, male-dominated societies more, or is it across the board?
So it's more or less across the board in countries. The only countries where females tend to do better than male are Eastern European countries, for example, and some Asian countries. Difficult to say exactly what is the reason behind that. There's probably culture. There's also probably financial terminology that is perhaps meant more for men than for women so far. So there may be a case in helping women. There is also confidence, really. So women not only tend to display lower level of financial knowledge, but as you probably know, also lower level of financial confidence. So probably trying to empower them with the knowledge will help them not only improve their knowledge, but their behavior as well. And we know that women are quite often very good captive audience. That is to say that they want to learn, they are not overconfident about their own skills. Yeah, and that's a benefit in terms of financial literacy.
All those know-it-all men, eh?
I suspect not, but on average.
Well, think they know it all. We. All right, you've accumulated all this data. There's been a massive study. More than 50,000 people have been polled. What are you going to do with it in terms of taking it forward for those individual countries and across the OECD?
So first, we will get deeper into some of the data. So what I presented is just a selection. We have much more work ahead of us on, for example, long-term planning, retirement planning, fraud. So we'll start by exploring those. We'll explore more the gender gaps too. And we'll also continue trying to assess more countries. So we really encourage countries that have not used the questionnaire to do more of that in order to do more of regional comparison that you mentioned, because we do believe that if we compare countries that are culturally similar, it will be more easy to even identify more effective approaches, I would say.
We look forward to the results. Flore-Anne Messy, merci. Ladies and gentlemen.
Bye.